Day AD. Part 1. Are you ready? Jorge is traveling to Brazil by plane. He thinks that Brazilian culture is interesting. He wants to live in Brazil forever. Brazil. Are you ready? Jorge is traveling to Brazil by plane. He thinks the Brazilian culture is interesting. He wants to live in Brazil forever. Part 2a. Present. Jorge is traveling to Brazil by plane. Is Jorge to Japan by plane? No. Jorge isn't traveling to Japan. He's traveling to Brazil. Where is Jorge traveling to? To Brazil. Jorge is traveling to Brazil. To Brazil. Is Jorge traveling to Manuel, his apartment? No, he isn't traveling to Manuel, his apartment. He's traveling to Brazil. How is Jorge traveling? By plane. He's traveling by plane. He's traveling by plane. Is Jorge traveling by taxi? He isn't traveling by taxi. He's traveling by plane. Who's traveling by plane? Jorge. Jorge is traveling by plane. Where is Jorge traveling to? To Brazil. Jorge is traveling to Brazil. Brazil. Part 2b. Past. Jorge was traveling to Brazil by plane. Was Jorge traveling to Japan by plane? Jorge was traveling to Brazil. Jorge wasn't traveling to Japan. Where was Jorge traveling to? To Brazil. Jorge was traveling to Brazil. Was Jorge traveling to Manuel, his apartment? No. Jorge wasn't traveling to Manuel, his apartment. He was traveling to Brazil. How was Jorge traveling? To Brazil. Jorge was traveling by plane. Jorge was traveling by plane. Was Jorge traveling by taxi? Jorge was traveling by plane. Who was traveling by plane? Jorge. Jorge was traveling by plane. Where was Jorge traveling to? To Brazil. Jorge is traveling to Brazil. Jorge was traveling to Brazil. Part 3a. Present. Jorge thinks that Brazilian culture is interesting. Does Jorge think that Brazilian culture is boring? No, not boring. Jorge thinks that Brazilian culture is interesting. Interesting. What does he think? He thinks that Brazilian culture is interesting. He's the They think that Brazilian culture is interesting or boring? Interesting. He thinks that Brazilian culture is interesting. Boring? Interesting. No. Interesting, not boring. The culture of where is interesting? The Brazil. The culture, the Brazil, or the culture of Brazil. 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 Part 3b. Pass. Jorge thought Brazilian culture is interesting. Did Jorge think that Brazilian culture is boring? Not boring. He thinks that Brazilian culture is interesting. Jorge thought Brazilian culture is interesting. What did he think? To Brazil, the Brazilian culture. This culture is boring. It was interesting. He thought it was interesting. Part 4. Jorge wants to live in Brazil forever. Does Jorge want to live in Sweden? No, not Sweden. Jorge wants to live in Brazil. Brazil. Where would Jorge want to live? The Brazil. Jorge wants to live in Brazil forever. Does Jorge want to live in Russia? No, not Russia. Jorge wants to live in Brazil. Brazil. Who wants to live in Brazil? Jorge. Jorge wants to live in Brazil. Does Jorge want to live in Brazil forever? Jorge. Yes, Jorge wants to live in Brazil forever. Does Jorge want to live in Brazil for 1 year? Forever. Jorge wants to live in Brazil forever. Not only year. Does Jorge want to live in Brazil for 1 month? Jorge wants to live in Brazil forever. Brazil forever. For 1 year? Forever. Jorge wants to live in Brazil forever. Brazil forever. Part 5. Jorge, you're traveling to Brazil by plane. You think that the Brazil is interesting. You want to live in Brazil forever. In Brazil, you can learn the Portuguese, practice well. You're on this. Good luck, Jorge. Personal question. Do you think the American culture is interesting? Yes, it's very interesting.